Format is a little different. All right, recording in progress. Today's format is a little different. We've been bantering about this idea of the value of a human life when it comes to automated autonomous vehicles, transportation, rail, all of those things. And so we've put together some experts. This is Carnegie Mellon at its best. This is interdisciplinary. Maybe when you introduce yourselves, also say which college you're in, to show the interdisciplinary nature. And the title of it is You Can't Put a Value on a Human Life, but economists do, right? And so we're going to talk about the ethical and economic considerations and implications of transportation. So the way we're going to do it is I'm going to ask our amazing panelists to give a brief introduction. We have a couple of questions, but then we love participation. And so don't be shy. You're all Carnegie Mellon. This is what it's about. It's engaging in conversation. We have an hour together. So with that, I'm going to go to my esteemed colleague, Henry Posner.
So hi, everybody. My name is Henry Posner. I'm adjunct in the Dietrich College, and I teach the world's only course on railroad deregulation. Please keep in mind that safety was never deregulated. My course is about economic regulation and focuses in particular on the underlying safety culture of my industry, which I am very proud to represent. The genesis, oh, by the way, my day job is I own and operate railroads around the world. Currently the USA, Germany, France, places we used to be, Guatemala, Argentina, Colombia, Mozambique, Malawi, and Estonia. So I started teaching late in life, and my life experience is the basis for the course. But the genesis for this discussion was a couple years back when Jerry Cohen paid a visit to the course at the exact moment we were talking about how you calculate the value of a human life, which, by the way, in France is between 1.5 million euros if you're on a train and 1 million euros if you're in a car. Because if you're in a car, you've chosen to discount the value of your life. So the starting point was this, and in the back, so Jerry said, well, I got to disagree with you. In the USA, it's $8 million. So, straight. So the question is an American life more than a French life? And is somebody who is driving a car or riding a bicycle worth less than that of a normal person? So I thought it'd be a very interesting topic, and particularly respectful of the memory of Jerry Cohen, who's also somebody who, it's all about engagement and the data to use this as a starting point for this very interesting discussion. And very proud to serve Safety 21. So bring it on.
All right, we're going to have a lot of fun. Truthful raising of hands. Who knows who Jerry Cohen was? Okay, all right, so half the room, maybe 2/3. Amazing human who was former president of Carnegie Mellon for 12 years or something, and also a very well-regarded professor in environmental and civil engineering, and a good mensch, a good guy overall, right?
He was the best.
He was the best. We miss him. So with that, Karen, our economist, introduce yourself.
So hi, I'm Karen Clay, and I'm an economist at the Heinz College. And so I want to just sort of give you a little bit of a primer on how economists think about VSL, just because I suspect this isn't something you think about every day. So I want to start by thinking about two extreme positions. One is that we don't value human lives at all. That doesn't mean we wouldn't invest in safety. And the reason is because we want to protect cars. Cars cost money, trains cost money, airplanes cost money. And so even if we didn't value human lives, we would still invest in safety, obviously at a different level. If we valued human lives infinitely, which some people argue we should, the problem then becomes we should invest in an almost infinite amount of safety as well. And that also causes problems because, of course, there's lots of resource demands across the economy. And so it's not perhaps going to be feasible or desirable to invest an infinite amount of money. So the main point I want you to take away here is that it's probably not going to be optimal to either assign a value of 0 or a value of infinity. So what do people do in practice? Well, there's sort of 3 ways that it gets calculated. One, which is primarily used by the courts, is that they sort of sum up people's earnings over their lifetime. And so if you die when you're 40, then they would sort of project out what your income would have been, add that up, and perhaps pay that to your heirs. This has lots of problems primarily related to people who are not working, like the elderly, children, caregivers, et cetera. And so this creates some sort of weird issues around that. A second thing they do is sort of survey people about risks and try and back out what people's value of a statistical life. And by the way, we're thinking about a value of a statistical life as the amount that you're willing to pay to change small amounts of risk, right? So we're not talking about how much do we value your grandmother, right? It's really this, how much do we value these small changes in risk? And so in this second scenario, they do surveys. These surveys have gotten somewhat better over time, but it turns out to be hard in these hypothetical scenarios to elicit what people feel is probably kind of true values. So the third way that economists do it is basically to look at how people trade off these risks with wages. And this is what most government agencies in the United States do. The advantage is we're looking at real people trading off real risks. And then what we do with that is we look at that trade-off and then we scale it up to the value of a life, right? So if you're willing to pay this amount to reduce risk by 1%, we multiply it by 100 to figure out that you, in a statistical sense, would be willing to pay that amount. Then the same VSL it varies a little bit by government agency within the United States for slightly weird reasons, but they're all pretty close. But all of these in the United States treat everyone the same, right? And so unlike what Henry was talking about, where different values are used, for example, in France for driving versus taking the train, US agencies don't do that. There was one attempt to do this at one point where they wanted to have a lower value for the elderly. You can imagine what happened, which is the elderly went kind of berserk on this issue, and the EPA quickly retracted that. So just to give you a sense, the Department of Transportation in the US in 2023 was using a value of a statistical life of $13 million. So an investment in safety would be cost effective if it saved one life for less than $13 million. I think I'll stop there. I mean, one of the sort of interesting things is this actually originated around World War II with the military trying to think about trade-offs between human lives and expenditure in a wartime context. But is today, we get to the 13 million.
All right, I love it. So the answer is it depends. Okay, I love it. Okay, Alex, introduce yourself.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm Alex John London. I'm the K&L Gates Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies in the Department of Philosophy in Dietrich College. So I'm going to say a few things, make 3 points. The first point's an ethical point, the second point's a methodological point, and the third point is back to kind of an ethical point, but from a policy perspective. So the first point is there's a long tradition in many different cultures, but it's like a very crystalline articulation in the works of Immanuel Kant for a very common sense idea, which is that if you want to be an ethical person, then you should treat people differently than you treat things. A really important thing about things is that they're fungible. All the way back to Aristotle would say, like, yeah, the whole point about money is to allow you to commensurate the value of like eggs, houses, shoes, and stuff like that. And so like the nice thing about like this tablet or my shoes is that there's some number of shoes that is the value of this tablet, some number of these tablets that's the value of this building, and then it's a little bit weird to be like, yeah, I could look at you and be like, how many shoes are you worth? And like, could I fund you out, right? Like, is there like when I'm thinking about you, should there be some number of shoes in the background where I'm like, this is the value of you and what I should do with that. For Kant, in this tradition, the idea is that if you've already started thinking about that, no matter what else happens, that's a fundamental transgression. That's a kind of moral wrong, and that's a thing that we want to avoid. Let me give you a really concrete example of this. In the novel and the movie Sophie's Choice, has anybody seen this? It's old now, so heart-wrenching movie, right? And at one point, Sophie is forced by the prison guards to make a choice between the concentration camp guards, between her two children. And she chooses one of her children. And of course, in addition to the moral tragedy that one of her children is murdered, part of the moral valence of what happens is that she has to choose which child she values. Now, there's a certain standpoint from which you could say, well, as like revealed preference theory says she already had this preference, and she's just revealing it. And if you would really like an interesting way, so now's the methodological point. So finish that ethical point. I think this is the idea that asking people to actually put a price on a human life is a certain type of violence that we want to avoid. Now, the methodological point is I don't think that's what we're actually doing in many of these cases. And part of it is the need for better integration between the humanities perspective and more mathy perspectives. Because I think there's a lot of things that we do and we have these mathematical models, and then what we call them, sometimes we're a little bit loose. So for instance, the EPA doesn't say that what they're doing is putting a price on the value of a person's life, right? They say, when we elicit these kinds of things, we're asking, like they'll say mathematically, right? How much would you pay if you were 1 in 100,000 people to reduce the risk of one death, blah, blah, blah. And then the question is, what should we make of this exercise that we've just asked people to perform? And so if you'd like to live your life this way, then you could start to think about like, well, did you take the car here? What was the monetary value you put on your life and the other lives that you put at risk by doing that? If you're sitting here and you're not donating to Oxfam right now, so there are a discrete number of lives that you could save with the time that you're sitting here by donating money to Oxfam, are you saying that listening to this lecture is worth the N number of lives that you could be saving by giving your money to Oxfam right now? Some of those lives might not be savable if you donate later today. And so I think like you could arrange your life this way and think about literally every choice you have somewhere along the line translates into the life and death of somebody else. I don't think that it would be a good way to live from a moral perspective, but also methodologically, I don't think personally that there's anything methodologically that leads us to think that either you are or ought to be thinking about the decisions that you make in life this way. Since we're in some big basketball tournament right now.
March Madness.
March Madness. Let me give you the third point is a policy point. Why does this matter? Well, there's different types of norms. Basketball is a really good example of norms that are fungible. So if you want to know what fungible norms look like, look at basketball. The last 3 minutes of a basketball game last 45 minutes, right? And why is that? Because somebody gets the ball and they get fouled. And so fouling is a thing that has a price. It's a move within the game that has a price. I'm going to foul you. I'm going to pay the price. Maybe I'm even going to foul out, but like that's okay because the overall strategic importance is the game and I'm just one player and they're going to substitute somebody else in and blah, blah, blah. In golf, you've probably never seen it. It's this, like they have a white ball and they hit it down. But like, there's never a point where your opponent is about to swing and you go, so that you could win. Like that norm is never violated because there's no price you could put on it. You would be persona non grata. And so, why it matters how we talk about these things is that do you want a world where we start to think about harms to other people as like purchasable, fungible, like basketball harms? Or do we want to think about them more as, well, things we wouldn't even think about? A just society is something you arrange where you don't have to make these kinds of trade-offs and you don't have to think this way. And that's much more like the status of norms in golf. I prefer the latter to the former.
I love it. Oh, there's so many things to talk about. All right, great. Albert.
All right, so hi, I'm Albert Presto. I'm in mechanical engineering. And now I'm like A, feeling morally fraught, and B, worried about what this will reveal about the way my brain is wired to hear those.
You're an engineer.
So yeah, I'm an engineer, and I think about things like an engineer. So my research is on air pollution and air pollution exposure. And so a lot of what we've done is to think about how does air pollution vary, for instance, across a city, right? So I think you could easily appreciate that, yeah, like certain, like if I go stand next to Forbes Avenue versus like in the middle of Shenley Park, it's going to be more polluted right next to the big roadway than in the park, right? And we can think about that across a whole city, right? How does air pollution vary, neighborhood to neighborhood within a city? How does it vary between cities, right? Can you compare the cleanest and dirtiest neighborhoods in these different cities? Because ultimately, air pollution exposure harms people's health, and that's something that is widely distributed, right? So like, if in a given neighborhood, there are 1,000 people or 5,000 people or whatever, they have some exposure profile that could be different than a neighboring neighborhood. And often communicating those differences can be a little bit challenging, because just to give a sense, this ends up being like an issue of small numbers, right? So if I were to go outside right now, and the pollutant that causes the most health effects is particulate matter. Particulate matter concentrations are in microgram per cubic meter, which is small, right? Like think about a cubic meter is like a box the size, like the size of a yardstick on each side. We can measure a few micrograms of particles in that box. And a difference, if this neighborhood to my right is at 10 and this neighborhood over there is at 8, you might think, well, 10 and 8 are not that different. But actually from like the exposure standpoint, if you long time live in a place that's 10 versus long time live in a place that's 8, that's actually a really big difference. So, being able to sort of translate those small numbers into something like, okay, this is so many deaths, or these, if we change air pollution by this much, we avoid this many deaths, and this has this much sort of dollar value to it. I think that makes it more tangible for people, right? So now we're talking in shoes instead of, sort of abstractions of how many particles there are. But also it I think helps convey some of the urgency, right? Because we can sort of say, all right, air pollution is worse in this neighborhood than in this neighborhood, therefore you are more likely to die in this neighborhood than that neighborhood. But it's not like necessarily like you specifically, right? It's sort of like your odds of dying or your odds of living a shorter life are slightly higher. But if we can put like a dollar number to it, I think that's something then that people can understand and appreciate, and it's again more tangible than just sort of 10 versus 8. So I would say the last thing is that I am not super concerned about how the number is set. Because what I care about a lot is like the differences between these two neighborhoods, right? So the number is just scaling that difference up or down for me. So there can be arguments about how do we set the number and what is the right number. I'm just an end user, right? I'm agnostic a little bit to how the number is set.
All right, I love it. So you can see like lots of diverse aspects of the same question, right? So we're gonna have a little conversation, and I'm gonna start with Henry, who's been taking amazing notes throughout, so.
He has a whole page full.
He has a whole page full, so you're ready to answer this question, which is, I've heard you talk about safety is numero uno in the rail industry, and yet today you talk about monetizing it. How do you reconcile this? And no corporate speak, please.
Well, first of all, I don't speak corporate speak, which is helpful. But I think, I want to shape my response based on what we talked about before. Yeah, the rail industry is all about safety. And some of you in the room will never believe that somebody who is in business could possibly prioritize safety. The only thing I can say is safety is your license to operate. And when the community or the regulators lose faith in you, you're out of business. But we as an industry do the right thing because, one, it's where we come from. We were a regulated industry. We became an actual business only after deregulation. Take my course. But the other thing is we do the right thing because we can afford it. So I recognize that Summer Lee has said that our industry is defined by greed. For those of you who've seen the film Unstoppable, remember the scene where the city's about to be wiped out by the out-of-control chemical train, which is of course based on a true incident, which it wasn't. And his response is, what's it going to cost? As much as I like to talk about how you can monetize it, first of all, it's not how we think. But more importantly, English is not the universal language. The dollar is. Our world is based on commerce, like it or not. So let me cut it off there, because today's conversation is not about any of my three favorite subjects: culture, drainage, or me. But I would hope that there be some interesting questions from the audience.
Excellent, I love it. And actually, fun fact, Unstoppable with Denzel Washington was filmed in Pittsburgh. Did you know that? Right outside Pittsburgh, yes. My friend worked on the set.
Yeah, so I was asked to be a technical advisor to that film, and I knew it was gonna be such a bullshit response. It would make our industry look bad.
And it
I
did.
said, I don't want anything to do with this, because I knew how it was gonna turn
Yeah.
out.
All right, I love it. Okay, that's your homework. Watch the movie.
Is bullshit a corporate speak word?
Yes.
No,
Okay,
And they sometimes exercise.
okay,
it as well.
Mierda de Toro.
All right, Karen, I'm going to you because you talked a little bit about some historical examples of the value of a human life in the United States and how that's changed over time. Can you tell us a little bit about how has it been, has it risen with inflation? What are the things that have impacted this value over time in the US?
So typically, when we think about it, two things, they do adjust it for inflation every year. Often there's kind of this weird norm where it'll just be set at this value in 2020 and everyone sort of references it even if it's 2025. But in the actual documentation, they basically adjust it to 2025 or whatever the year is. So it does get adjusted for inflation. The other thing that it gets adjusted for is GDP. So in 1940, the US was far poorer than it is today, and roughly speaking, the value of a life was around, the value of a statistical life was around 1.2 million, something like that. So the point is that it's a value that's specific to a particular location, in our case, the US, in a particular time period, as no doubt will get talked about. Different values are used around the world. And you should think about that, again, not in a kind of normative sense, but for these different places, for regulatory purposes, they're going to ask, what are people in our country, how are they trading off this risk for money, and then multiply that up. And so, again, I think economists are very clear. They don't want to have this discussion about a value in the U.S., a life in the U.S. is worth a different amount than a life in some other country. You should think about these as primarily being used for domestic regulatory purposes and varying because primarily GDP is different.
All right, great segue to you, Alex. So let's dive in a little bit about, because countries do value a human life differently, and community, and so can you talk about how that comes about and what are the factors, and does that mean that the value is different in different countries?
I mean, I think you get into problematic issues if what you want to say is, people who live in different places are worth more or less than, so someone in this place is just intrinsically morally more valuable than somebody else. Now, this is why I think what you're actually doing is saying something like, given the resource basket that these people have and then the trade-offs that they're induced to think about when you ask them this elicitation process, like the pay, then what's their appetite for risk? And so, yeah, absolutely. Like the Germans have the Autobahn without any speed limit. They have a greater appetite for risk than places that have a lower speed limit. And whenever we decide how should we change the speed limit, I don't think that most people are going, well, how much do I want to pay for those excess deaths? We know there are going to be excess deaths, right? But there are people, rather that are saying something like, what's my risk tolerance for my ability to do all of the things that I want to do? And also, like, what kind of car do I have and how fast do I want to be able to drive? And so in that sense, my worry is like giving a really weighty name to these things, is a little bit misleading, because if it's something like, what's your attitude to risk? Like, do you enjoy going really fast, right? Which has lots of consequences, environmental, pollution, your own risk to your own safety, other people's safety, and so on. But then necessarily selecting out one of those consequences and saying, well, that shows your value for a life. My worry is now you're trying to infer from that things that you probably can't.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting, and it's like, I actually had a conversation with my husband who is talking about getting a motorcycle. And I said, that's great, but just make sure that you've doubled the life insurance policy before you do so, because that's, I'm putting a value on.
You didn't marry a vegetable, you married a man.
There you go. But being on a motorcycle is very risky, but he will wear a helmet. But I think the point is, though, when you do the life insurance questionnaire, they will ask you, do you do risky behavior? Do you scuba dive? Do you own a motorcycle? I think, do you skydive? All things I will not do, by the way, because I'm risk averse. But it is, that's the thing too, is like actuaries, like people who are just deciding on the value of a human life, they are also deciding based on you as an individual taking that risky behavior. So it does happen. All right, yes, I married a man, not a vegetable.
Well, so just to clarify.
Yes.
If somebody's in a life support system.
Oh, got it.
And I'm thinking of the analogy in Mexico, where a bus company told its drivers, if you injure somebody, please back up and run them over, because it'll be less costly to the bus company if the person is dead than to maintain them in a hospital. And I'm sorry I can't quote that, and I'll have to go out and find it and use it in my course.
Yes.
But I recall reading it in the press, which means it must be true. So that might be something for people to research, is, place by place, how do you deal with stuff like that?
Right. Yes. We're a little off topic, but it's okay. It's good. It's all right. I took us there. Albert, questions for you. Are the air pollutant risks associated with transportation equitably distributed, or are certain groups at higher risk?
So I guess the short answer is, are they no and yes.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Are they equitably distributed? Oh my gosh, I can talk. Are they equally distributed? No. So we're thinking about I think a lot of people, when they think about transportation pollution, they're thinking about what's coming out of cars and trucks on the road. Obviously people live at different distances from either roads or busy roads. Systematically in the United States, that living in close proximity to highways or other busy roads is very racially biased. Basically white people are more likely to live far from high traffic areas than anyone else. But there are other transportation risks. So, okay, who here remembers when the train derailed 2 years ago in February? Okay, cool. Sometimes I ask that and people don't. So that happened not far from here. So that town in Ohio is 60 miles from here. It takes an hour to get there. And so, that the presence of that rail line constituted a risk. There was this particular accident, right? And there were these exposures or potential exposures to the people in that town. The thing that struck me, because we did some work there and I went there, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever had to have class stop for the rail line that's down in the hollow, right?
Because the noise?
Yeah, because it's too loud.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Now imagine that those garages down in the hollow were your house, right? So some of these people that were displaced by this rail accident, literally the train went through their backyard, right? It was 100 feet from their back door. So even in a case where there were no issues ever, right, that they still have a higher risk, right? Or there's some extra exposure because train is burning diesel, and so then they have this diesel source that goes through their yard a couple times a day. You know, so that's another example of how these, you know, sort of risks or exposures can be sort of distributed to different people in different ways.
Thank you. Did you want to make a comment?
May I?
Sure, go for it. And then
Okay.
we'll go to the audience, so
Yeah.
think of your questions.
Yeah, okay, so I think one of the things that we need to remember is that when railroad lines were built, the communities followed the railroad lines. It's not like rail lines were located in communities of color as opposed to something else. East Liberty is a great example. There was a recent press release about covering up the busway and how this would right a wrong that was committed in the 60s when the busway was built through a community of color. Except that that was actually on a railroad line, which was built in the 1860s, when there was nothing. So please keep in mind that as communities evolved, they evolved around railroads. And if you want to buy a cheap house, you went next to a railroad track. Only you worked in an industrial plant near the railroads. But it was not like the railroads had targeted communities of color. The communities followed the railroads. So looking at economics and history is an important way to interpret some of the things that we will be talking for the rest of this period on.
Did you want to say anything? No, I'm looking at you, Karen. Nope. Okay, all right. Okay,
I do.
great. Okay, go for it.
Right, so I am not saying that the rail lines were built in a targeted way, right? There were sort of like the land is amenable to it. Roadways were built in a targeted way,
Right.
and this is pretty well attested.
Right.
There's lots of you can read on redlining, which was this policy that basically the federal government started insuring people's home loans, and so they sent out loan officers, and they went around and basically graded land between like I don't know, blue was the best, and then green, yellow, and red, right? And red was all the stuff that was like next to a factory or next to a rail line, and basically they would not insure loans in the red places. And then incidentally, the banks wouldn't give loans to people of certain races. And so those folks ended up sort of stuck living in the places that have been marked red, right? So it's, there is like there's some malfeasance, there's some malintent there. So there are a lot of books, so there's a book called The Color of Law that lays this out really nicely. That was written by a lawyer. It's like sort of like almost like it would be his like guidebook if you wanted to prosecute this in court. You can look up the old redlining maps. I don't remember. It's the University of Richmond has put them up, and you can click around them and see the comments. And I show this. I have a like environmental justice lecture I give sometimes. You can click around like there are parcels along Forbes that were like graded yellow because it was like the houses here are nice, but there are a bunch of Jewish people that live nearby, and they're encroaching on this neighborhood, so we've downgraded it.
Wow.
Like it's extremely explicit.
They did not expect for that to, well, I guess, yeah, fascinating. Great information. I think a former researcher here has also looked at bridges, and that bridge height also has varied. So there have been, so that trucks couldn't pass in whiter neighborhoods. So their trucks weren't allowed to be on certain roads in more white neighborhoods. But in black neighborhoods and more industrial neighborhoods, they had big, bridges so big trucks could go under that, under the underpass. So there have been some intentional decisions made on location.
Yeah, and if anybody studied Robert Moses, the power broker?
Right.
Bridges were designed to make sure that a bus could not go to Jones Beach. But here's what people don't talk about. Before Robert Moses was in New York, he was here. And that explains why we no longer have one of the world's largest private sector light rail systems. His client was the Allegheny Conference, and one of his top priorities was to downsize public transportation. And he got his start here. He perfected his art in New York. until he met Jane Jacobs.
Right.
And that's another story for another day.
That's another story, but she's amazing. So look her up as well if you don't know. All right. Any questions from the audience? Yeah. Anything, Tia? Or, oh, all right. I meant online. Sorry.
Oh, nothing online.
Jeremy.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to pose something and see how you all respond to it. But I mean, I use vehicle value statistical life in my own work, but I disagree with the framing that you know, you can't put a value on human life, but economists do. I don't think anyone puts a value on human life. I think that the value, the confusion is primarily because we've named it value of statistical life. But what it really is willingness to pay to reduce mortality risk. And you know, when Karen said like you can take the willingness to pay for a very small reduction in risk and like scale it up to 100, that's just when we're talking about large scale projects that are going to increase lots and lots of people's, you know, risk of mortality by a very small amount. And these are decisions we all have to make every day, just driving to school, not donating to Oxfam right now. There is some sense in which if I thought that the, you know, deaths of waiting an hour to donate to Oxfam were huge, then maybe I wouldn't be here. I mean, there is some sense where there's like some sense of magnitude that I need to figure out how to prioritize. So anyway, point is, bottom line of my point is, do you agree that framing this as value of life is just wrong, not what we do, but that risk is something we do always value, and that really what economists are doing is trying to understand how much value people put on risk by watching the decisions they make. Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, Alex.
So I don't think that's what we do. I agree with what you were saying. I think this is largely just a misnaming something that we do. And I think if we thought about it in terms of risk, then that opens up a wider array of things. So I want to talk about something like Albert said, where it's like, well, what should I make of the fact that like that there's different particulate concentrations in different places and so on. So I think one thing is the policy challenge of like, what do you do to try to wake people up to what these risks are and galvanize them to take action? But then the other thing is like, well, how should we quantify these risks? And now I think then what is a helpful antidote here is to think about all the many different mathematical ways in which you could try to quantify these risks. Because you could ask, how many avoidable cancers of various type are we going to see? That's very different from saying, how many quality adjusted life years are we going to lose? Which is different from saying, how many disability adjusted life years are we going to lose? Which is different from how many people are going, how many people are going to die who otherwise wouldn't have died. And you could go on, and that's because there are infinitely many different ways to try to quantize those different risks. And the part of this is what's going to be the best way to try to galvanize people to eliminate them. But also some of them are like, how do we try to be consistent about the way that we allocate the scarce basket of resources that we have to allocate? And the only thing that bothers me, I think these are all really interesting questions. The only thing that bothers me is when people try to sidestep the substantive issues about why use one metric or another and try to make it seem as though one metric is sort of the mathematically correct way or technically correct way or something like that.
Yeah. Karen.
So I just want to say I think Jeremy's exactly right. And economists, to be fair, have tried to get people to change. There have been various campaigns to try and get people to change how we discuss it for exactly this reason, which is these are small changes in risk for small changes in payments in some sense. And so if you think about it that way, it does really change the discussion. Unfortunately, it got named value of a statistical life at some point, and it's been very hard to change that name.
Any other thoughts? Okay.
Although I see value of reduced mortality risk, VRMR, showing up.
So maybe we're making progress.
Great.
So if I could just, and I'm not an economist, but maybe one way to bridge this is to think about, you're not making a decision to hop on a bicycle and get out in traffic every day. You've adopted a lifestyle in which there is a consistent thread, which is for the next 10 years, you'll find me on a bicycle as opposed to walking, as opposed to taking the bus or whatever. That might help a little bit in terms of making it more systematic.
All right.
And this is distinctly different than from, say, after 9/11,
where they were trying to assess whether this person's life or that person's life was worth how much or less.
Right. I had actually asked that question of Karen, and why don't you answer what you told me?
We're not in the business of valuing individual people's lives.
Right.
I mean,
this is distinctly different.
It's very different, and you shouldn't think about, it's a misuse of the concept if that's what people are doing with it.
But what was the context for 9/11?
After the victims of that, there was a panel set up and they assessed whether this person was earning this amount of money or wasn't, if they were a caterer that happened to be there or they were an executive, the value of their lives was assessed differently.
Okay, so since today's all about me, whenever we talk about 9/11, what I'm thinking of is how many people were killed by the TSA by being discouraged from flying? And I'm guessing that there were more people killed by the TSA by discouraging people from flying because they drove instead than were killed on 9/11. Sadly, I'm shooting from the hip there, which I almost never do, but certainly by encouraging people to drive and engaging in a more risky behavior, there was an unintended consequence of the formation of the TSA, which I believe to this day has never caught a terrorist. I may be wrong about that. I don't believe they've ever caught a terrorist.
And for another day, I'm going to avoid that one. Chris.
I wanted to follow up on some of the comments about regulation of workplace and restrictions on people's choices. That given that there is some value of life and some idea that we want to reduce risk, where it really gets difficult is when you're trying to restrict people's freedom. And you can think about speed limits on vehicles, for example, so that you can't go too fast. You can think about helmets requirements for your motorcycle, Karen. All of those are very controversial restrictions on freedom of choice. And I was wondering about the panel's viewpoint on that.
And it goes state by state too, in many ways. I think that's part of that challenge is that states have regulations. Like in Pennsylvania and Connecticut, you don't have to wear a helmet, but in lots of other states you do. So yeah, thoughts?
As she stares at me. So I think there's a fundamental trade-off, which, as you said, I think varies across states. Which is all of these things have externalities. So if you think about driving very quickly, the externality is, there are other externalities, but the main externality is that you're going to cause an accident and harm someone else, right? And so there's an externality, and therefore economists would say above some speed limit, whatever that might be, we don't want people driving 100 miles an hour because the risks of accidents goes up very quickly, right? And so I think that's the economist's view for why we should regulate that. Now, you might think, well, okay, but that probably doesn't really apply to motorcycles because mostly motorcyclists are probably injuring themselves more often than they're causing accidents. Again, we'd have to look at that statistically. I think that the issue with motorcycles that people worry about is that if there's a significant chance that some of these people will be impaired, they don't have life insurance, and therefore end up being supported by the government, again, one needs to evaluate the relative frequency with which these things happen because people talk about these things, but we actually need data, right, to think about these things. Then people would say that the state has a reasonable interest in regulating, making motorcycles somewhat safer, and so requiring people to wear helmets. Now, different states have different trade-offs, but I think those are the kinds of things that people think about when making these kinds of decisions. And, some of it implicitly is going to depend on if you think that freedom has infinite value, then you're just going to let anyone do anything they want because we don't worry about the externalities. But I think most people in the US think that freedom doesn't have infinite value. And so, but it's a complex issue for sure.
Yeah, Alex.
I want to say this is very like my most CMU comment, I think. Freedom does have infinite value in certain circumstances if the person you're talking to follows all the axioms of decision theory. But if you reject completeness like I do, then there are going to be lots of cases in which you look like you assign infinite value to something, but that's just because you won't make every trade-off that people are asking you to make. And so I think in cases where like the only harm is to you, and you can give lexical priority to liberty over other things, then it looks like it's of infinite value. And the only reason I wanted to make that really technical point is because I think sometimes people sneer at the idea like, well, how could you assign infinite value to that? Because if you do that, then you must be consistent. And now I can just give you a second context in which, of course, you don't assign infinite value to it. So I've caught you, right, logically. And so that's why I want to be like, I worry about that kind of trap. Because I think it actually is a good case where genuine public policy things really do kind of depend on some pretty archaic technical matters, and I think there's a lot of machinery that we use because it's tractable and because it's very common, but where at bottom there are alternatives. And anyway, so it's a great place where very technical issues intersect with value theory issues, and so that's why this is a good place to do ethics if you.
It is at Carnegie Mellon, and again, it's very interdisciplinary, so you can touch on it in every place. I think as freshmen, don't you have to take a? Oh, did you have a question? Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I did have a question.
Thank you.
So I was curious how BSL is calculated by willingness to pay. How does it account for economic disparities? So like maybe one group, for example, I'm a grad student, don't get paid much, obviously, but at some point I might get paid more, so maybe I'm more willing to take a risk now, considering that I don't get paid quite a bit, than I would in the future if I got paid more. Or like even just between different groups and their willingness to pay in terms of considering their starting income. So that's crazy.
Okay, so two things. The main way that it gets calculated is actually looking at workplace risk versus wages. And you should think about the values that we use as being approximately like the median value in a large population. And so it's not meant to be thought of as like you versus you versus you, right? It's meant to be a kind of population average, and it's particularly constructed based on people working and trading off these specific risks. Now, one may or may not like that, but that's how we actually do it, and so that's how you should think about its use in practice.
We have a question in the chat.
Okay, great.
So this starts with a statement and then finishes with a question. This person says, it is common practice for departments of transportation to not make safety upgrades to roadways or intersections until a life has been lost. How would you argue for or against this practice based on your expertise?
Great question. Yeah, sadly, true. I think that's the reality is sadly it's true. And at the same time, we do have technology that's being developed here at Carnegie Mellon to help look at those near misses and look at those potential of incidents and crashes, and then give that information to the DOTs, like the local DOTs and the state DOTs, so they can make those interventions. The stitch in time saves 9 to save those lives. Does it happen? Still a work in progress. Still a work in progress. But there, sadly, people, pedestrian and vulnerable road user death is at an all-time high, right? We have over 40,000 vehicle, because of a death of a vehicle, but vehicle to vehicle is actually coming down. But vehicle versus, like man or woman on the street is actually at an all-time high. So that's my 2 cents, being a part of Safety 21. I'm curious what your all yins think about this, to be Pittsburgh.
I mean, I'll just say I don't know the truth here, but I can imagine a world in which if I'm the Department of Transportation and I have far fewer resources than there are crosswalks or other intersections to address, then I could ask myself, like, do I have a probability model that I really believe that's going to tell me where to go? Or like, I know what's possible if it's actual, and so if someone gets hit at an intersection, then I know it's a risky intersection for sure. And so like, and I've got to prioritize, like, where do I put my resources given that there's too many things to do? So I go where there are accidents with the idea that if there was one, there could be another. And it's not anything about value of a life so much as just like, if this is a risky place and I know that from there being an accident, then I go there and try to fix it. And ideally, we would anticipate it with something that's like, these are the worst, you know.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a project, Ding Zhao from Carnegie Mellon Engineering is partnering with the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure here in Pittsburgh to do something like that, but before there have been incidences and crashes. So, yeah, Henry.
Well, I was going to mention Pittsburgh. So a couple fun facts. One is that a previous mayor of Pittsburgh signed us all up to be guinea pigs in the autonomous vehicle experiment. You know, I wonder what trade-offs or whatever were involved in that. But second, if you look at what the city is doing in terms of the Complete Streets program, I would argue that in many cases, they've actually made it worse. There's a blind crossing in front of the Islamic Center, which seems to have been laid up by somebody sitting in an office and not getting out into the real world. So I would hope that there is some correlation between fatalities or injuries and what they're doing. I do not have that level of faith in the city of Pittsburgh. Within 15 minutes walk of here, there have been roughly 5 people killed in the last 3 years. I can name one of them because I knew her, actually, and I almost knew the second person. But when you can name people who've been killed crossing the street, you know, of all the indignities that should be making us rise up, that's not front page news. We accept it as part of our lifestyle.
Any other thoughts? We're in the home stretch. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, Alex.
I have a question, like, you know, for the group maybe, which would, if you assign a monetary value to, you know, risk like we're doing, and you want to take it seriously, and then you succeeded in being like something like the airline industry, where at least until very recently, you know, domestically there weren't any accidents. Would it follow from that you'd be like, actually, we're too safe, so we need to start allocating some of our money someplace else because we're not getting the bang for our buck? Like, where we're spending more, like, is one of the like, I would think this wouldn't be the way you'd want to think, but that's my question, right? Like, if you're literally like, oh, we overshot the mark, we're too safe, right? Like, so it's okay, we can be a little bit more lax because if there were 3 accidents, then we'd be back on budget. You see what I'm saying?
Yes,
like,
I hope those conversations are not happening somewhere. I shudder. But maybe they are. I'm curious, what are thoughts in the audience? God help us. All right. I think we're not safe enough. All right.
I would just say limited budget. If the airlines are extremely safe and something else is less safe, and you have limited money, you could spend the money on making the less safe thing more safe,
So road transportation.
for example. But I mean, it all depends on the marginal benefits of paying money on each of these different. Not that there's a safety budget that you're trying to get 3 accidents per year, but rather, if one mode is way safer than another mode, there could be an opportunity to spend limited resources in a way that saves more lives, and you get the trolley problem, which lives, and, you know.
Right. All right, we're in the home stretch. Any other questions from the audience?
We have a question.
Oh,
So,
wait,
go
okay,
ahead.
sorry.
No, take the question.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, so going back to the French valuation of human life example, where there's a difference between like cyclists or motorists and train goers, how would you go about evaluating different modes of transport? Like, we've talked about motorcycles, we've talked about autonomous drivers. Like, how would you place a life on a human value of a person inside an autonomous vehicle? Or any like other types of motor vehicles such as ATVs, side-by-sides,
Right.
4-wheelers. We have everything else that can be like roadworthy on the public roads. you have to place some value of the driver. So would you go about like weighing the average of the risks or something like that? Because I don't know if you've ever insured a motorcycle, but the insurance premium rates are extremely like low compared to a regular car. Yeah.
Don't tell my husband, but okay. Any thoughts on the variance?
So in the US, almost uniformly, they use a single value across all, for a given risk. But there is this sort of interesting issue which has arisen particularly with respect to airlines, which you mentioned. And the issue is because the average person on planes is actually far wealthier than the average person in the United States, there has been some discussion of whether they should use a significantly higher value there. I think again, that these equity issues are very complex, and this is part of the reason why in the US we've used a single value, and why I'm sort of interested in the fact that France uses A, much lower values, but B, different values in these contexts.
So I'll just comment, that's not just France, but it's the UK. UK is roughly about 2 million pounds now, which is roughly 3 million, but it's still, a fraction of what we value in the USA.
Yeah, great. Okay. All right. We're in the home stretch. Final tidbit you want to leave with the audience. We'll just kind of do a rapid fire final thoughts. I'm looking at you, Alex, and we'll go down.
I think these questions about rationing and like the trade-offs that you want to make, a decent society is one that tries to minimize those in your everyday life, but there are going to be various places, like during the pandemic, how do you ration ventilators or other things like that? And I think you do have to have social conversations about that. And I think we want to avoid metrics that say, so I think it's one thing if we're saying something like, we're trying to replace the income that you've lost by losing your partner, which to me is a very straightforward thing. And I take it that that's part of what we decided on after 9/11. And I think that's much far better than saying we're trying to somehow substitute for the value of this person who you lost. And so I think in that sense, just naming the things that we're doing in a little bit better way that sort of keeps like economic trade-offs, as opposed to something like economic versus like your worth as your dignity or things like that,
Right.
Make for cleaner policy.
Love it. Karen.
Hopefully you've come away thinking that economists are, not valuing lives. So that would be the main thing I would take away.
Good takeaway.
It's a value of a statistical trade-off, right? And what was the language you were using, Jeremy? I completely forgot it.
Value of reduced mortality risk.
Okay, yes, think of it as value of reduced mortality risk.
Great. Albert.
I also like the idea of value of reduced mortality risk, because that's what we're thinking about is, if you lower exposure, then you lower mortality risk. Maybe that's the way to go.
That's Chris's phone. Okay, Henry.
And for each transportation mode, safety is your license to operate. And people can take comfort in the fact that every transportation mode is working on continuously improving their safety record, and they're improving against themselves.
All right, well, good. Well, I am really humbled by the expertise and thoughtfulness of the panelists, so please join me in thanking them. All right. A little parting information. I want to thank you all for coming. This will be posted on the Safety 21 website on our What's Happening page with a link to the video in case you want to watch it again. Share it with your friends. And we have another session coming up in April, so stay tuned and thanks for coming out. And thank you. We have leftovers.